Now we are
Is
unmuted.
this on TV tonight, by the way? Is it?
Has to be a public meeting. We ready?
Yes.
All right. So I will call to order the Monday, January 27th, 2020 meeting of the Oregon City Planning Commission. And item number 1A is going to be introduction of our newest member, Chris Staggs. Chris, welcome to the group. We're glad to have you here. Anything you'd like to say?
Thank you. I'd just like to say I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to making a contribution to the city from a public servant perspective.
Good. We're glad to have you here. Okay. Item number 2 is election of Planning Commission Vice Chair and Chair for 2020. So we'll start with Chair, and we will open nominations.
Well, I think Mike's led us well, so I'll nominate Mike for chair.
A second or third.
Other nominations?
I've got popcorn, I'm happy.
All right. I don't see any other nominations, so do we need to vote?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. No other nominations. We'll close the nominations. And
I can
do
just
we-
go down the line and call.
yeah, I was going to say we probably should get it on the record, right? All right. Go ahead.
Or you can do them
Call a
all
roll.
and say aye or nay. Okay. Commissioner Guy?
Abstain, aye. He needs it more than I
Schleidenhofer?
Aye.
Commissioner Gage? Aye. Commissioner Stoll?
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Staggs?
Aye.
And Chair Mitchell?
Aye.
All
You
right.
really realize I've made it through 8 years without having to serve in that capacity? All right.
We're not done.
All right.
Well, 7.5.
Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. And we will move on. We will open nominations for Vice Chair.
I'd like to, I can't speak, nominate Dirk.
I'll second that. Any other nominations? Okay, I don't see any, so we'll close the nominations and go right to the vote.
All right. I'm
Mr.
going to
Way.
start with you, Commissioner Staggs.
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson?
Aye.
Commissioner Stoll?
Aye.
Commissioner Gage?
Aye.
Commissioner Schlagenhofer?
Aye.
Commissioner Guile?
I guess so.
Chair Mitchell?
Aye.
Motion approved.
All right. On item number 3, which is public comments, there are no members of the public present, so there obviously are no public comments. We'll move on to item number 4, for a legal training. Ms. Terwin.
All right. I will pass it over to our Assistant City Attorney, Carrie Richter.
Thank you. I have done this legal training for many of you for a number of years, and so I've got to give you all your money's worth and educate every one of you, even though many of you have served for, like Commissioner Guile, 8 years, and Commissioner Staggs has served for about
8 minutes.
5 minutes. So I'm going to try to focus on putting everything together. And you all, one of the biggest tasks before you for 2020 is going to be adopting your a new comprehensive plan. And the city's comprehensive plan is how many years old?
2004.
So it's 25 years old? Is that the math?
No.
20 years.
15 years old.
50?
15 years old. So, I think maybe only Laura Turway may have worked here. Have you worked here for 15 years? Mm-hmm. Laura Turway and I are the only people who have been around the Planning Commission for that long. And even I was just a baby lawyer, and so I don't remember it. And Laura was a baby planner, so I don't know if she remembers it. But so anyway, so this is a big task. And this is the comprehensive plan is the constitution that drives the city's planning program. So there's a lot to it. There's a lot of moving parts. And so I want to talk to you about sort of all the components that are going to go into this and sort of what role it plays in the larger planning scheme that the city operates under. At the same time, I'm going to cover the same old ground, the ex parte contacts and the conflicts of interest and all that boring stuff, but you have popcorn to keep you awake. My goal is for us to be out of here before 8:30, but if you have questions as we go along, please interrupt. This is supposed to be a dialogue, and it's for you, as well as for everybody else here. So please share your comments, criticisms, jokes, anything. This is yeah, keep it exciting, would you? It's on you. We'll count on you to keep it exciting. So with that sort of introduction, I'm going to jump right in and talk about the background regulations within which the city operates. And we have the federal and the state and the regional land use framework. And so we've talked before about the federal requirements. The most noted federal requirement comes from the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution provides a couple of real property guarantees to property owners, most notably the takings clause that says that government cannot take private property without just compensation. 5 words that have led to more Supreme Court cases than many other 5 words in constitutional jurisprudence, but so that's one of the parameters in which we operate as a city government. Due process and equal protection, that has to do with the process that we give to folks when they seek a land use approval. Equal protection has to do with treating folks fairly and equally. In addition to the Constitution, there are federal laws and regulations that we have to abide by. For example, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Those are things that are in part implemented through our land use regulations. The RULIPA, I threw that in there just so you guys could all learn a new acronym. It stands for the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. You might ask what religious land use and people who are in jail have in common. The answer is that they are religious land use activities, and incarcerated people are subject to discrimination as a result of their religious beliefs. And so this act protects them from activities by local governments that serve to curb religious activities. So this is the situation where a church is in a historic building and they won't let the building be remodeled because of design overlay restrictions, but the building needs to be remodeled in order to further a religious exercise. For example, the building needs to be expanded so that a religious figure can live in the building, because that's part of a religious practice. And so to deprive this church of the ability to expand, to accommodate this religious practice is discriminatory and is not allowed under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. So churches, religious institutions have a special protection under that act. So you all have gotten your money's worth today. I can go home. Okay, so
Learn something new.
the state of Oregon regulations. These are the sort of lion's share of the framework of that we work under in land use. These are the statutes, the Oregon revised statutes, and the 19 statewide planning goals. And these statutes provide minimum procedures that the city has to follow when it processes a land use application. The statutes provide some substantive standards for particular types of land uses. For example, the one we talk a lot about is clear and objective standards for housing. When we review applications for housing, we have to review them subject to clear and objective standards. That's a term of art that can be contrasted with a discretionary standard. So that's why part of the equitable housing effort that Laura put us all through last year was to ensure that our regulations are clear and objective and satisfied that statute. There are regulations that govern annexation of land into the city. There are statutes that explain how we have to control our public records and how we have to run our public meetings. And then the 19 statewide planning goals are ambitious objectives that the state has identified as goals to be achieved through land use regulation. And they are broad and they are vague and they say things like protect natural resources. The level to which we have to protect natural resources is not defined by the goal. In some cases, the administrative rules that implement the goal give further direction. For example, there is Planning Goal 3 that requires the protection of farmland. Planning Goal 4 says the protection of forest land. It doesn't say how we go about doing that. But the Department of Land Conservation and Development, a state agency charged with implementing land use policy in the state, has adopted administrative rules that say the protection of farmland is the protection of land with certain soil characteristics. The protection of forest land are lands that are capable of growing a certain amount of timber. Planning Goal 12 requires planning for adequacy in our transportation infrastructure. The administrative rules implementing Goal 12 provide for how we have to plan for transportation, and that requires identifying what our population growth is going to be over a planning horizon, determining how much traffic that generates, and then planning roads to develop roads accordingly. So those are all set forth in administrative rules. The third sort of level of regulation comes from the regional metropolitan government of the Portland metro area. Metro sets the location of the urban growth boundary for Oregon City and all of the other Portland metro cities because it's one big line around the whole metro area that we're all partners in its determination. Oregon City is lucky or unlucky because it is on the edge. And so when the urban growth boundary gets expanded, it usually includes land within or adds land to Oregon City. So that adds another challenge or another opportunity, depending on how you look at it. But Metro is the entity that decides that. Oregon City does not decide where the urban growth boundary is. Metro decides what the population growth will be. They decide on a regional basis. They decide where that allocation of land for, if they decide they need land, where the land's most suitable for inclusion and the urban growth boundary will be, and they are the ones that expand the urban growth boundary. So the city participates in that process, but we don't decide it. Commissioner Guy.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
Has the city decided, because they determine the urban growth boundary, I know several of the cities are trying to determine whether they should go forward with annexation. And I was here at one of the commission meetings where they were determining whether they were going to put a hold on it for a while. Have they ever decided what they're going to do here in Oregon City?
On annexation?
Right, because remember there's several that they were considering, and I was here that night where they said we're going to put a hold on it. I thought that's what they had said they were going to do. And so while Metro determines urban growth, the cities still are allowed to decide for themselves. Is that not correct?
Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but
Okay.
I think the short answer to your question is you are correct that the city has decided to analyze it a little bit further, but I don't think we've had any annexation applications that we've held up as a result of sort of thinking about it and talking about it a little further.
Okay, thanks.
So, Portland the Metro government also has what they call the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, which is a lot of words that mean that they have regulations that the cities have to implement For example, Goal 5, statewide planning Goal 5 has to do with protection of natural resources. One of the natural resources that's included in Goal 5 is protection of streams, riparian corridors, and wetlands. Metro has implemented regulations for how local governments have to do that. And so the city has then in turn implemented those regulations as part of its planning program. So when we're talking about our comprehensive plan amendments, for example, we're going to have to keep in mind what the Metro regulations require as well, because we cannot contravene them.
Are there other goals other than Goal 5 where Metro has set out requirements?
Most of them have to do with riparian areas, wetlands. There are requirements about urban planning for in the Metro requirements. It's the Metro requirements that require us to concept plan, and we're going to talk about a little bit about what concept planning is, but in some, Metro expands the urban growth boundary, and after that happens, all that does is expand a line. The land within that urban growth area retains Clackamas County jurisdiction. And it retains Clackamas County zoning. So it's rural zoning, like 1 house per 5 acres or 10 acres, not urban zoning, 5 houses per 1 acre or smaller. So it retains all of its characteristics of being part of the county, even though it's in the urban growth boundary. So all that does is sort of show a line on a piece of paper. The Urban Growth Management Functional Plan requires local governments to then adopt a concept plan, which is like a miniature comprehensive plan for that area. And so that is what the city adopted with the Beaver Creek Concept Plan. Beaver Creek Concept Plan had to comply with these Metro requirements about how you sort of start the dialogue about the long-term urban development plan for these areas. Because you wouldn't want to have to adopt a whole new comprehensive plan for this little area that's just been added to your urban growth boundary. So moving beyond sort of, we talked about the federal requirements, the state, we talked a little bit about the regional government requirements. So moving on to Oregon City's regulatory framework, we start out with the charter, and the charter has provisions primarily for the structure and management of the city itself. It calls for the operation of the city commission, and it calls for what the city manager does and the city recorder does. This planning commission is not identified in the charter, but is rather called out in the Oregon City Municipal Code. The charter, in addition to sort of the operation of the city, it identifies the determination of city boundaries. It says that the boundaries of the city are set, and unless dictated otherwise by law, annexation shall be determined by the voters. And that's the provision that is the voter-approved annexation provision within the charter. And so up until recently, with a change in the law, the city had voter-approved annexation in all circumstances. We can talk a little bit more about the change in the law, but that's where that provision comes from. It comes from the charter.
Is there any new news or update on the lawsuit over
No.
this? Okay.
No.
Any reading the tea leaves, how soon it might be?
Well, there is a challenge by the city of Corvallis arguing that the charter protections for voter annexation should trump the change in the law that says that charter voter requirements cannot control. So the question is, the legal question asked to the Court of Appeals is whether or not the charter and home rule controls, or whether this change in state law that appears to trump charter and home rule controls. And That case was argued in June of last year, and we are still waiting a ruling. There is no timeline in which this Court of Appeals has to rule. Unlike land use cases have timelines where they say, Court of Appeals will rule within 77 days of oral argument, for example. You don't have that same requirement for non-land use cases. So we don't have a sense. I've had cases that have taken a year. The longer it takes, probably that suggests it's better for local governments, for the charter camp, because it means that the court is going to overrule what the lower, makes it more likely the court is going to overrule what the lower court said. Some people think, but you never.
And that decision could still be appealed to the state Supreme Court, right?
It could. It could, but the review by the state Supreme Court is permissive. In other words, it's not by right. So you have to ask the Supreme Court to take review.
Right.
And so it's not clear whether they would or they wouldn't. If they do take review, it would be 5 years. 3 to 5 years.
One question. So
Yeah.
if their Court of Appeals does rule one way or the other on it, could we then start making decisions on annexations based on that, or we still have to wait and see if it goes up to the Supreme Court?
We don't have to wait. My recommendation probably would be to wait until the initial appeal period to the Supreme Court, which I think is 60 days.
Okay.
So probably you get a ruling from the Court of Appeals, you'd probably wait 60 days just because you'd want to see if there's an appeal.
Yeah.
If there is no appeal within 60 days, then you're good.
Okay.
Who would appeal? Secretary of State?
Maybe, or Corvallis.
Well, I mean, if
It would
Corvallis
depend on who wins.
Yeah. Okay.
So if the law was considered, or that the state approved for annexations was found, are deemed to be unlawful, any annexations that occurred in between that time cannot be reversed, right? They have
They
to
wouldn't,
stay-
I don't think they would be reversed.
Even though it could be said it was unlawful to put that in the first place?
They would not be reversed because they were decisions that were made when the statute was in place.
But still deemed illegal by a lawsuit.
But in most cases, a lawsuit does not stay the effectiveness of a law unless you get an injunction or a stay.
I see.
You know, an injunction is when you go to the court and say there's an immediate harm, you need to stop enforcement of this law. There's no injunction in place or a stay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we've talked about the charter. Moving on to the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan provides the local implementation of the statewide planning goals. So it's the comprehensive plan where the city has said, these are the things that we are going to protect. This is the development we're going to support. These are the sort of policy guidelines we're going to follow. And this is a long-term planning document. So 20 years out. In 20 years, this is the kind of city we want to have. And so that's what the comprehensive plan is. It includes within it components that are city directives and then components that are directed specifically at private development. And so there are comprehensive plan policies that say things like the city shall ensure public participation during its land use reviews. Well, that's directed at the city, not directed at a developer. That is a guiding principle for the city. There are other policies, though, that are more directed at development. We can talk a little bit about those. I've got an example of one a little bit later, but it's important to know that not all of the comprehensive plan policies are specific to private development. I think probably if you were, I haven't actually mapped them out, but I bet more of them are directed at what the city will do than what private development will do. Because when you think about the city's got an obligation to be able to serve development. We've got to provide it with water service. We've got to be able to provide sanitary sewer service. We've got to be able to provide roads that are adequate capacity. We've got an obligation to ensure that the development will function in a way that is compatible with the neighboring property owners or the city as a whole. So there's a lot that the city has to take into consideration as part of its review and long-term planning policy decision-making. So we also attach to the comprehensive plan as ancillary documents are utility master plans. And you probably heard us talk about the transportation system plan, the stormwater master plan, the sanitary sewer master plan, water master plan. These are planning documents similar to the comprehensive plan, except for they're specific to a utility. What they do is they evaluate the condition of the existing system, identify, given the population projection and the job growth and all that kind of stuff that the city's expecting, what kind of additional infrastructure investments are going to be necessary? And where are those infrastructure investments going to be necessary? It's not that the city's committing to pay for them, it's just planning for them. So that when a developer comes along and wants to, say, change the zoning on a piece of property to make the development more intensive. A applicant comes and wants to annex property to bring it into the city. The urban growth boundary gets expanded. We can know exactly what kind of infrastructure improvements are going to be necessary to serve that development. And then we're not just sort of scratching our head going, I have no idea whether or not the roads are wide enough. I have no idea whether or not, I think about, I've got relatives in upstate New York and they have townships there, right? They don't have this coordinated government stuff. And so you go there and and the townships are tiny. So when you go there, you go from one township to the other, the roads go from super smooth to super potholey and bumpy because there's no coordinated planning, and then the infrastructure in the roads is so poor and it's not mapped that there's collapses all the time because their pipes are super old and they don't map them. And so I have a friend who's a professor there. I'm like, how do people live like this? And he's like, you take for granted that in Oregon you have to plan for this. And I thought everybody did this. Like, why doesn't this make sense everywhere? Well, apparently we're the exception. We plan for things, and by planning for things, then we're able to meet the demands of development when it happens. So anyway, that's the important role that these utility and infrastructure master plans play. And then when we get a development proposal and we need to determine if, say, we've got pavement in this development that does not meet what our transportation system plan identifies as necessary to serve the development, then we have a basis to ask the developer to contribute to that improvement because we've planned for it. So it gives a legitimacy to our decision-making that is really critical. Moving on to the Oregon City Municipal Code and zoning map. Is the zoning map on the wall? No. Everybody's seen
It
the
used to
zoning.
be.
Yeah.
You have it memorized.
Right.
I know what my zone is.
Commissioner
so.
Staggs, this is one of the things. After 3 months, you get a test on the zoning map, and we bring out colored pencils and you color it, right? Isn't that how it works? And everybody has to pass, or No. Anyway. The zoning map works, it's a color-coded map that shows what zone all of the land is in, and I'm going to assume you all know what a zoning map looks like and what I'm talking about. But more importantly, I think the Oregon City Municipal Code, so over there, Tom's using it as a footrest or something.
I'm using what?
The municipal code book. Is it there?
Is it over here?
No, it's over, it's down the counter a little bit.
Anyway.
Oh, it's way over there.
It has all the day-to-day land use regulations that the planning staff uses to review development. And it implements the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan we talked about is sort of these discretionary, sort of 60,000 foot level policy objectives for the city. The rubber hits the road with the municipal code. And if the municipal code says you can do it, you can do it. If the municipal code says you can't do it, you can't do it. And so this is sort of the detailed nuts and bolts of what you all are asked to interpret, consider proposals against. The municipal code has a whole bunch of provisions that have nothing to do with land use planning, but the land use planning parts of it include zoning and overlay designations and the use authorizations allowed in the various zones. It has provisions about land divisions and development standards, and has land use procedures. So just as an example, I wanted to show you so you could just see the difference between a comprehensive plan policy and a municipal code provision. So comprehensive plan goal 10.2 says supply of affordable housing. Provide and maintain an adequate supply of affordable housing. Well, what is an adequate supply? What is affordable housing? All of these things are sort of 60,000 foot level. This is something we will do. How do we implement that policy? Well, one of the ways that the city's decided to implement that policy is to allow greater density in the single-family residential zones by authorizing corner duplexes. And so that authorizing corner duplexes helps to implement goal 10.2 potentially. And then what circumstances in which we will allow corner duplexes is then set forth in the municipal code, and it provides very specific, clear, and objective development standards for allowing a duplex, including the height of the units, the configuration of the units, where the entrances have to be. The list goes on and on. But you see that the comprehensive plan policies are much more general and do not, if we use the comprehensive plan policies to regulate development, there wouldn't be a whole lot of guidance to an applicant or to an opponent about what will and will not be approvable. Whereas the municipal code regulations provide more specificity and provide more predictability for the land use program, and also allow staff to implement a lot of these land use approvals or implement these code standards, and they don't have to come to you. Questions? Comments? There are other construction-related regulations that have to do with land use, but they're not things that you all review. For example, once somebody gets a land use approval for a land division, these are subdivisions or partitions. once somebody gets a land use approval for that, they go forward and they proceed with their development by installing the roads and installing the infrastructure. But the first step they have to do is divide the land. And they divide the land by recording the final plat. And that is the map survey showing where the new property line is going to be as a result of the land division. And so reviewing the final plat is done by the building official or Public Works? Who starts that process?
Public Works.
Public Works starts the review, and they confirm that all the conditions of the land use approval are satisfied, and then once they are happy with the improvements that are necessary in order to record the plat, then they sign off and the planning department signs off, and then the county surveyor is the body charged with recording the final plat, and that's when the land is officially divided. So this is a process that does not ever come before you. Building and construction code, the electrical code, the plumbing code, the residential building code. These are all detailed construction standards about how you can build a house or how you can build any kind of building, and that is implemented by the city building official. And that's not something that we have any purview over. The third sort of big category of things are public works infrastructure design standards. I think they're also called standard specifications and design details. And this is, again, the engineering design components that go into how thick of asphalt you have to put in and what the consistency of that asphalt has to be and how you build a curb and how you build a cul-de-sac and all of those sort of detailed infrastructure specifics that are implemented by the Public Works Department, are mind-numbingly boring to people like me, and sort of, they probably say the same thing about the law stuff, but anyway.
Everybody has their role.
Everybody has their job to play, right? So anyway, so these are things that are all sort of land use-y things, but these are things that that is not within our parameter as as part of the planning department, land use planning purview. So let's just walk through these standards, taking an example of urbanizing some land. So, and we've kind of talked through this already, but just because I have the slide. So step one, land gets added to the urban growth boundary. So Metro decides it's appropriate to urbanize land, so because they need there's a need for a greater amount of land, and so they expand the urban growth boundary. We talked about how the next step, as the city's job once the urban growth boundary is expanded, is to adopt a concept plan. That means we have to decide how we are going to urbanize, how we want to urbanize this area. So when the urban growth boundary was expanded to accommodate Beaver Creek, one of the justifications for the expansion was the provision of industrial land. And so that's why a fair percentage of the Beaver Creek concept plan provides for industrial land, because that was one of the bases that Metro brought the land in. But it's not specific exactly what industries we're going to serve with this area. It's not even specific enough to say that this amount of acreage has to be industrial. There's a little bit of play, because Metro, when they decide to expand the urban growth boundary, they don't go ground truth the area. They don't go walk around and say, oh, there's a stream here, oh, there's a steep slope here, there's a wetland here. They just say, you know what, this is not high-value farmland, this is not forest land, this is land that can be served with infrastructure, so here is a good place to expand the urban growth boundary. So then it falls on the city to decide what makes sense from a ground-proof truth plan. So the concept plan is a robust local evaluation of where the industrial land will be in this area, where the residential land will be, where the commercial land will be, how the roads will run. But even that is not dividing land. It's not a land division. It often does not even set the zoning. All it is again, the 60,000 foot level concept plan for what we're thinking we want this area to look like. Step 2 is most often annexation. Yeah,
Before you leave step 1,
yeah.
so we have 3 concept plan areas, Park Place, South End, Beaver Creek. Those were all driven by this requirement?
I know that that's the case. I don't know about South End.
I think so. The rules for doing concept plans have changed throughout the years, and we've been expanded our urban growth boundary a lot. So even Beaver Creek has like 3 different times of expansion or something
Of urban
like
growth
that.
boundary land in it.
We did create the plans all around the same years under the same assumptions though.
So
Okay,
Park
so-
Place,
but-
Park Place and Beaver Creek, yes. South End, I'm not sure, but I think so.
Okay. We have a lot of other land between the city limits and the urban growth boundary. That we don't have to go back and create concept plans for those, like play catch up.
No.
No, the
But-
slivers around town. So we have the big
Yeah.
chunks with these
Right.
concept plans. The rest are just pretty slippery.
Okay. But if Metro were to come along and, in whatever year and add, go further out Beaver Creek Road or something, then if it's a substantial chunk, we would have to do a concept plan for that also, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
They changed the rules throughout time, so now we have to do concept plans when it stands.
Changing the rules?
Who would do that?
Can you send that bowl back down this way?
Oh, before it goes.
Yeah.
Wrong bowl. I didn't think anybody else was eating it. I thought you said bowl. I'm like, what?
No, send the bowl back this way. I was trying to be discreet, but that didn't work. Okay, step
Just
2.
ask the question so you can say this.
So I do have another example that is the school district. Last year, the year before, I lose track of time, was thinking about requesting an urban growth boundary expansion in
right.
Holcomb area.
Yeah.
And so they put in a proposal to expand, and then Metro asked the city for a comment, but they're the ones that ultimately decided. If it would have been approved, they would have had to do a concept plan for their one property.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there a certain land size that kind of triggers the need for a concept plan? Is it just-
My recollection of those regulations is that it's any size.
Okay.
I think that if there were a sliver, if the urban growth boundary was expanded just a sliver, I think that rather than concept plan it, you could just, if it was just one tiny piece,
Yeah.
you could just annex it, rezone it, and adopt a comprehensive plan designation for it. And then avoid the need for a big concept plan because you wouldn't need it for a little tiny piece.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Because if you were going to bring in a little tiny piece, you would have some planning reason to do that. Like, you really need this piece for a road, or a pipe needs to go right here to serve some other area already within the urban growth boundary. So if you're bringing in a piece for a pipe, you wouldn't concept plan that area because it's not going to facilitate any urban, it will facilitate urban development, but it's not going to provide any urban land that will be developed for housing or other things.
Yeah.
Could you just attach it to an existing concept plan?
I think you probably could, or just attach it as part of your comprehensive plan. I worked on the Gresham Barlow High School, and the Gresham Barlow High School is outside the urban growth boundary, and they had to they would truck their sewage into Gresham. And so as part of the upgrading of the school, they wanted to extend a pipe out from the city of Gresham, which is like less than a block away from the Barlow High School. And so we had to get an exception. Our choices were expand the urban growth boundary for that pipe or get an exception to the statewide landing schools in order to bring a sewer pipe out to the high school. So anyway. So step 2.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry. So on step 1, when there's land added to the urban growth boundary by Metro, but it's not yet a part of the city.
It's not.
Yet the city has to adopt a concept plan.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But that concept plan doesn't have any regulatory impact until the land is annexed, because the land is not within the jurisdiction of the city.
It's still county.
It's still county land.
Yeah.
So the concept plan is really nothing more than printing on paper.
A proposal.
Well, it's adopted by the city. It is what is going to guide the city in deciding the annexation and the zoning that follows and everything like that. Again, the goal is to provide predictability, right? To give everybody a big heads up. This is what we're thinking about doing in 10, 15, 20 years.
So what jurisdiction decides that concept plan is the right concept plan?
The city that will bring the land in.
Okay. Not the county.
No, the city does it the city gives the county notice. And my recollection in Beaver Creek was that the county did submit testimony.
Oftentimes, there'll be county roadways that are adjacent to, so there is an impact. So they do definitely play a role. There might be utility services they provide.
So I find it interesting that the county is the one who decides where the urban growth boundary is.
No,
Metro does. But the city has to, I know because I've been through 3 concept plans, that it costs the city a lot of money to put in place a concept plan, all the hearings and all the staff time. So the county pushes the city, and the city has to put out the money to appease the Metro, it sounds like.
They do, but to be fair, we have received grants from Metro to pay for the concept planning more
That's
often
to cover
than
all your
not.
costs, because I always hear from you how much these things cost.
Probably not. Probably not our staff time, just consultant time.
Yeah, Metro pushes a lot. Okay.
Yes.
All right, step 2, annexation. So this is the process by which the city expands the city boundaries to include land within its jurisdiction. And annexation has 2 components to it. It has a land use review component, and then it has this second political component, this voter approval component. And the state statute that was amended to eliminate voter approval did not alter the land use approval component. It just eliminated the political component. So the city gets an application for annexation to include the lands within the city boundaries. The city has reviews that annexation proposal to determine whether or not it is possible to serve the land. The city doesn't have to actually serve the land upon annexation. Annexation, again, just brings it into the boundaries. It does not allow development. What allows development is zoning it to urban densities, right? Because when it's in the county, it's 1 house per 10 acres. The infrastructure demand resulting from 1 house per 10 acres is negligible compared to the infrastructure demand on urban densities. So it's the rezoning and that puts in place the development authorization that follows. So sometimes annexation applicants say, all I want to do is bring the land in. That's all I want to do. I don't want to rezone it. I don't want to plan it. I don't want to do anything. I just want it to be in the city. And so the city annexes it and it retains its county zoning. And says, and the applicant says, I'll come back at another time to seek the zoning in order to develop it. Then other times applicants say, I want to annex it and I want it rezoned. And there are a number of factors that may go into an applicant's analysis for which one they want to do. But either alternative we have approved, or we have allowed an applicant to do it separately or together. But the annexation land use review piece is, again, not to require that the infrastructure be there, but that it is possible to serve it. So it's more of a feasibility determination than an actual capacity question. And so one of the criticisms of that annexation land use review is that it's kind of toothless, because it doesn't actually require that the infrastructure be there.
What's the criticism?
That it doesn't require that the infrastructure be there. For example, there are circumstances where development of an annexed area will require a big infrastructure expenditure, like a pump station, right? Or a big arterial road. And questions about how that funding will happen have not yet been decided when an annexation application is filed. But that question does not have to necessarily be determined at an annexation phase. We know it is feasible to provide that pump station. We know it is feasible to provide that big arterial road. How exactly it will be funded and how the cost will be allocated hasn't been determined yet. Mm-hmm. But that is very unsatisfying to folks who see annexation as the jurisdictional trigger point. So that is one of the reasons why voter approval provides a political backstop, right? And that's one of the criticisms of eliminating it. For applicants property owners whose land are in the urban growth boundary, they have been concept planned, they have gone through an annexation process, the decisions about urbanization have already been made. So why put them through the rigor of, I'm not arguing, I'm just pointing out the arguments on both sides of a political vote.
And my question is, why do you suppose it was put in almost every city's charter to allow voter approval of annexations? If that was a consideration, did they not take that into consideration back when they put it in, all these charters? Because it still is in our charter.
No, I understand. It's in many charters, and I don't know why. All I can offer is that the state statutes that govern annexation provide for voter approval in certain circumstances and non-voter approval. You know, you've probably heard of the double annexation or the triple annexation. That has to do with how many people consent to the annexation, and it has to do with the vote, whether the people in the annexation area, all the property owners in the annexation area consent, plus all of the people who reside in the annexation area. I mean, there's all these sort of machinations in the statute about how annexation can occur. and sometimes it's voter approval and sometimes it's not, setting aside the charter. So I suspect that provision is to reflect that variation in state law, because the charter provision in Oregon City says unless otherwise specified by law, or unless law says otherwise. I mean, I can go get it, but it's something like, it has an opening qualifying phrase that says unless otherwise provided by state law, boundaries shall be set by the voters. So there's some acknowledgement of voter approval and not voter approval in state law.
I just found it interesting when you said the word political decision. I thought, is that because anything voted on is considered political decision?
Yes, anything that voters consider is a political decision because it's, right? You're trying to convince voters
One way or the
to
other.
support it.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Does the property have to be within the UGB in order to be annexed?
Yes.
It does.
There are certain circumstances where where there can be annexation outside the urban growth boundary for emergencies, but very, very rarely.
Interesting.
Okay, moving on. Can we move on? Safe to move on? We're halfway through the bowl of popcorn and we're an hour in, so I gotta hustle. All right, step 3 is apply the urban zoning designations, and we've talked a little bit about that happening. That is where I said the rubber hits the road for development. I mean, that is where development can occur at those densities. And so sometimes step 2 and 3 are together, sometimes step 3 and 4 are together, and sometimes step 2 through 4 are all together. It just depends on what the applicant asked the city to review. Step 4 is the development prong, and that's where the actual land use development is proposed. And there is the land division, a subdivision or partition we talked about a little bit. There's also a thing called a master plan or a planned unit development. And these master planning happens in for developments that are smaller scale than concept plans, but larger scale than single development, usually phased development. So for example, Clackamas Community College has a master plan, and that sort of talks about how they plan to grow and what buildings they're gonna build and how they're gonna operate their campus over time. Red Soils has a master plan. And the reason why applicants like master plans is because it gives them a single review of a bigger chunk development, and it guarantees that review of subsequent development will happen pursuant to the code standards that are in place when the master plan occurs. So it gives them an insurance policy that they will only have to comply with today's regulations, not regulations in the future. That is very good for an applicant because then they know they can predict how what their development requirements will be.
Can they choose to go by the new?
I believe they can choose to go by the new ones.
Okay, so like if you had a master plan and it was gonna be all single family, and now our code has changed to allow corner duplexes, I could do corner duplex if I wanted to, even though my master plan at the time it was adopted didn't allow for those.
Yeah, I think the county's master plan is a good example of that, because they have had so many different developments as it's phased in, and sometimes they'll choose the code that was in place when the master plan was approved or that part was amended, and then sometimes they'll choose today's code.
Okay, but it's up to the applicant, not the, okay.
But that doesn't include plumbing code and electrical code?
No.
Okay.
No.
No.
How long has master planning been around for the residential areas? I think my concept is master plans have been there for the county in bigger pieces of property that will be developed, we know, at some point in time. But is it relatively new in the residential districts?
I don't think there's no limitation on where a master plan can be
No, not now. Before 2004, we had planned unit developments, which were
Right,
master
yeah.
plan for residential. In 2004, we got rid of PUDs. We still had a master plan section, and you could have done a residential master plan. We just didn't have a lot of guidance on how to do it.
So
nobody
PUD
really
and a
did it.
master plan were kind of not all in the same pea shell, but they were similar.
Yeah, so the newest round of code amendments, we changed the title to say master plan / PUD, and now it's just interchangeable.
Okay.
So it's very easy, I think, to confuse the term concept plan and master plan because they sound kind of the same. And the important distinction, I think, is that the concept plan happens much earlier. And the concept plan is a metro requirement for land within the urban growth boundary that is added to the urban growth boundary. A master plan is is accomplished closer to the time that development is going to occur. And one of the code requirements for Park Place, as part of the Icon annexation, is that they do a master plan. And so oftentimes the city uses the master plan as a planning tool to provide for an interim step for big developments to sort of evaluate the infrastructure and the cost and all of the sort of competing factors that are going to go into a development that is of a bigger scale.
So a concept plan is done by the city, and master plan is done by the landowner? Is that a fair
Master
distinction?
plan is applied for by a landowner.
Okay.
Then we have, somebody else had a hand up or a comment or,
Yeah, I was going to ask on the concept plan, are the guidelines for concept plan? Who is the guideline? Where do those come from?
the Metro's urban management functional plan.
Okay. Gotcha.
But the concept plans are all discussed with several community meetings, correct? I mean, God knows I've been through enough concept plans meetings.
But also, in addition to the Metro regulations, the statewide planning goals are directly applicable to a concept plan.
Okay.
And the statewide planning goals would not be applicable to a master plan because the master plan is reviewed against the municipal code. It's broken. Time to go. There you go.
That was it, thank you, that was really good.
Needed some popcorn too.
Popcorn lasted all throughout it.
Okay, now we're sort of moving into more specific regulations that relate to the job the Planning Commission does. And I'm going to move through these quickly because some of you have already heard them. Commissioner Staggs is familiar with the development process a little bit more so than some of you may have been when you joined. So I'm going to move quickly and ask him to interrupt me when I'm going too fast.
Yep.
So there's different types of land use reviews in Oregon City. There's the administrative decisions. These we call type 1 decisions. For example, final plat review that I talked about, that is a type 1 decision. There's no discretion associated with it. So because there's no discretion, there's no notice, there's no hearing, and there's no opportunity for appeal. And these are all done by staff, and you never see them. There are 3 types of what we call quasi-judicial decisions. These are decisions where the Planning Commission or the City Commission sits as a judge. These are where the city's job is to review the proposal to see if it satisfies the applicable approval criteria. Type 2 decisions have limited discretion in the decision making, and so the process for those decisions is to provide limited notice to neighbors with an opportunity for those neighbors to provide written comment. The planning director makes a decision, and then folks who submitted written comment have an opportunity to appeal that decision to the City Commission for review. Type 3 decisions are the decisions that come before the Planning Commission. These are the discretionary review decisions to determine if the criteria are satisfied. They include notice, a public hearing by the Planning Commission or the Historic Review Board, and an appeal right to the City Commission. Type 4 decisions are plan amendments. That's where we change the text of the comprehensive plan, or zoning map amendments where we change the designation applicable to a piece of land that are applied to a particular property. The key here is it's a particular property. It's small-ish.
Does the master plan have to go through 2, 3, or 4?
Master plan, depending on its size, would go through either type 4 or a legislative decision. Is that right?
Thanks.
I think.
A
Master plan.
type 3, like the county or the hospital. Is that kind of master plan you're talking about? Yeah.
Or any of the concept plans?
Concept plans type 4.
Or
Master
legislative.
plans type 3.
Well, concept plan have a master plan afterwards.
Not always.
Like in
Sometimes.
Park Place, there was a concept plan, now a master plan. and I
But
was
Beaver
wondering if I
Creek
go-
won't.
Pardon?
For example, Beaver Creek doesn't have that requirement.
Okay, but Park Place did. I heard they were going through a master plan.
They are. When they had the annexation, the applicant self-proposed that.
So that's what I was asking. Do they go through 3 or 4 or both, or?
So when you do, the concept plan itself went through 4, the master plan or legislative, and then the master plan will be a 3.
3, okay, so it still comes through, okay.
Yeah, so Park Place is coming back to you.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Is this framework universal across the state, or is this specifically Oregon City?
This,
The type 1 through 4?
these categories of reviews are universal. They are based on authorizations in state law. The type 1 through 4 labels are pretty universal, but not necessarily. Some jurisdictions call them class 1, class 2. Sometimes there is no 4 in jurisdictions. The 4 is a legislative decision instead of a quasi-judicial decision. So there is some variation, but usually these are the numbers, and
Great, thank you.
But who does what is not the same across all jurisdictions. Like some of them have a hearings officer and not a planning commission. Some have, there's no appeal rights when others have it.
that's
Right?
true.
Yeah.
Yes.
And some may have, right now in Oregon City, well, for an Oregon City subdivisions go through a type 2 staff review. In some jurisdictions, that might be a type 3. And our code amendments, all those code changes, we had stuff that used to be a type 2 that we decided we can do this easier with no discretion over the counter, so it's cheaper and quicker, so it's a type 1.
I've got a question that goes back to the concept plan. How does the city decide what kinds of density would be the best fit for that particular area?
A bunch of public meetings to talk about it.
Okay.
I mean, there are some parameters. For example, Beaver Creek, like I said, was brought, some of the land in the Beaver Creek concept area was brought in to serve a regional industrial shortfall. So the city could not have designated all of that land residential.
Right.
But
But did Metro say how much high density they wanted? How much they didn't put any
No.
criteria in like that?
I don't think so.
Those are the 10 units an acre thing.
I
Well,
thought
but
there was
that's
a
just-
requirement for
that's just-
density.
But that's not, that's
Is
the
that
minimum
LCDC that
urban.
I know what you're talking about. can't
I
think
think
of it
that's what
was.
he's asking though.
Lori, I thought there was I kept hearing through, and some of us may have, through like Beaver Creek, that there's a requirement for so much density.
Or density goals or something.
Yeah, it's, we were just talking about this notion of a minimum of 10 units an acre is a minimum urbanization level for residential.
That's called the Metro housing rule.
Okay.
So the applicant can interpret the metro language and say, well, we think instead of doing X number of housing units per acre, it should be this, and they can,
Well, we have to meet the minimum, 10 units per acre, but then after that, we can decide we want to put a whole bunch of density over here.
Right.
This is a really good view corridor, so we don't want to have any houses here. We want to put a park here, we've got a stream here, so.
And
gotcha.
also, you can go beyond to do more density than the minimum. In our case, we have some concept plans where we only substantially comply, so we don't even really hit the minimum, but it's okay. We're kind of within that wiggle room.
So if somebody wants a sprawling lot, and I've seen some out Redland Road that are still in city limits, they have to have a minimum of 10, or that's just grandfathered in because they were there before the rules went into place.
You want to answer?
You know what I'm saying? I've
Yeah.
seen some that are huge properties. I couldn't believe it was in the city limits.
They're all going to be huge properties until
But you
they
said a minimum of
urbanize.
10.
But that's overall. If you
I
do the
see.
math at the end, because, I mean, you're going to pull out areas for streams where there's not, where you can't build on and other things like that. So it's overall. And some of these concept plans, we did these exercises where you had chips and you could like move them around and they represented different densities and stuff. At the end, it was to get the math all to add
Okay.
up. But you certainly have the right to say, we want a node here and we want the lower density here on the edge, things like that.
Okay, it's not gonna happen, but if somebody wanted to buy 10 acres of the high density and not build anything, could they?
Absolutely,
They could just put one shed on there.
absolutely. There's nothing,
No
you
requirement.
don't have to build anything. The point is, if you want to build, here are the standards in which you have to build, you can build.
So if all the neighbors didn't even wanna sell their land, it could just stay the way it is.
Right, and on that tailcoats of that too, the city processes the planning division processes applications as they come in. You see applications as they come in. We can't control what comes in, when it comes in. I'm sorry, sometimes we overload you on meetings because we have to. So there is, we are not the architects to timing. It's
Right.
always up to the property owner to decide what to do with their
So when
property.
people come in and ask, how can they stop development, they just have to talk to their neighbor and tell them not to sell.
Or buy it themselves.
Buy it themselves. Simple
So I've
stuff.
known people that have bought the vacant lot on either side of them just so they don't have neighbor. I mean, and they don't build it.
They could.
Yeah.
We talk about it, but then we never do.
God, I wonder if I could buy it all in Park Place.
You could. You absolutely could.
Okay, so legislative decision is the other side of the planning commission's role, in addition to the quasi-judicial type 3 decision-making. Legislation decision-making is policy-making decisions. And this is what adoption of the comprehensive plan is going to be. It will be a legislative decision. The planning commissions, there are some jurisdictions that the planning commission's only job is legislative. Multnomah County, the planning commission only does legislative decision-making. They have a hearings officer who does all the quasi-judicial stuff, which can be a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work because there's a lot of moving parts because there are no rules, right? The rules are protect streams, protect historic resources, provide adequate transportation. But other than that, it's up to you. So,
Can you remind me on de novo, is that open, or is that the one that's only
de novo
on things that are on the record?
The way I think about it is like new. De novo is Latin for like new.
So they can hear anything.
So they hear anything.
I see, okay.
So the city commission, in legislative decision
That's only
making.
on legislative.
Yes, only on legislative decision-making. The city commission's review is de novo, meaning they take new evidence and they consider they consider testimony from others, whereas in the type 3 decision-making, an applicant's only opportunity, or a participant's only opportunity to submit new evidence is at the planning commission level. And then the city commission's review is limited to the record that was created before the planning commission.
Quick question for you, Laura. So we're looking at the comp plan this year. But the comp plan has to meet with the codes. You said we're gonna have groups of meetings of citizens, so they can't change the code. They're only looking at the comp plan that's within the code, right? They can't go and say, we wanna see that code changed. They're only looking at the overall picture.
Yeah, we're gonna update our comprehensive plan this year, and the comprehensive plan could have action items like go update your code to allow more types of housing, like we just did, or something like that. So it could have some action items in it, but no, we're not
It
changing our
could
code.
influence the code that we just went through years of updating and changing.
Yeah, I was just making that as an example, but
Yeah.
if, for example, re-inventorying natural resources has been an item of discussion, that could make its way into the comp plan to have an action item to re-inventory the natural resources across the city.
How much
So,
influence do the citizens have on that comp plan?
the most, because they're writing it. The comprehensive plan is a plan by the community, for the future.
But the city must guide that in some way, because a lot of individuals coming in saying, I want this and that, they don't understand that you have to follow certain codes or there's certain requirements. They can't come in willy-nilly and say anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about our process a little bit later, but we just want to know what people want for Oregon City. What are our priorities? What do we value? And then we can deal with figuring out state law later. Like, I don't need to tell everyone what state law is. Just tell me what you want to see here, and then we'll kind of,
Okay, thanks.
But we'll go through that together.
But it's the municipal code is supposed to implement the comprehensive plan and not the other way around. So we're not bound by what the municipal code says.
Then Carrie, wouldn't the comp plan come before the code, all the code changes? Wouldn't that have been the way it works?
It could have, but that's not the way the city did it because of the desire to address equitable housing and diversity in housing
Okay.
first.
I think it's a cycle. We'll do our code. I mean, you'll see us do these. There never is a one before the other because it's
a
just
chicken and egg
continuous.
situation.
Keep you busy.
So at the start of every type 3 hearing, you will hear Chair Mitchell read a script, and that script is a public service announcement for all of the people who are attending the public hearing to know what the rules of the hearing are going to be. And in those disclosures, there are a couple of critical components that I'm going to share with you, but they are components that are part of the land use review process in addition to being disclosures. One is that there are applicable approval criteria that apply to depending on what type of application it is. And the staff report that staff puts together, making an initial recommendation to the Planning Commission, identifies those criteria and sort of summarizes the application in relation to those criteria. The disclosures also note that a staff report has been made available 7 days in advance. So that staff report is emailed to you as part of an attachment to the agenda for the Planning Commission meeting. The disclosures provide that testimony must be directed to the applicable approval criteria. This is important because you have a job which is to evaluate whether the evidence is sufficient to satisfy the standard. So when people come and they testify about things that are relevant, those cannot be considered as part of your determination of whether the criteria are satisfied.
So that's, the public can testify on anything they want.
Sure.
It's kind of our job or part of the staff's job to sort out 1, 3, and 5 don't even apply. Get rid of it, and 2 and 4 are they?
Well, I think it's in part staff's job. I think it's in part your job to understand that, and it's in part an education. That's why we include it as a part of the disclosure so that people know. For example, the best example I can think of is a church applicant. Church applicant comes and they bring 100 people to talk about what good work the church does. Whether or not the church does good work is not an applicable approval criteria, or what a good person this applicant is. that is not an applicable approval criteria. So when we're managing hearings and we've got a room full of people, we need to encourage people to keep their testimony towards the applicable approval criteria, because that's what we're here for. And that's what we have jurisdiction over. That's what we can evaluate, not the quality of the character of the applicant. Another disclosure is they have an obligation to raise issues. Quasi-judicial hearing procedure is like review is like a funnel. So it's at the first phase, we want all of the evidence, we want all of the concerns to be voiced at the very first hearing, and the Planning Commission is the very first hearing body. So we want to encourage folks to bring their issues in early. That's a fairness issue to all of the participants in a proceeding. It's a fairness issue to the city so that we know what people's concerns are. It's a fairness issue to the property owner so that they know what areas they may have to adjust their application, and it's a fairness issue for concerned citizens who need to know exactly what everybody else's concerns are. So anyway, so there is an obligation to raise issues. If you do not raise your issue, the City Commission may not consider your issue, because we talked about how the City Commission's review is limited. And then if you're still unhappy with the decision and you want to appeal it beyond the City Commission to the Land Use Board of Appeals, you have to have raised issues before the local government in order to be able to raise them at LUBA for LUBA to consider them. And the reason this is a rule is to keep people from sitting in the weeds and raising issues after the fact, right? Laying in wait. No land use lawyer, I know would do something like that, but anyway, it's a strategy. Another issue is an obligation to raise constitutional issues. This is the takings clause issue. You have to raise a takings concern early in the process so that the city has an opportunity to respond to it. Again, it's a fairness issue. You have a right to an impartial tribunal, which means that the Planning Commission is not going to be biased or have a conflict of interest or have otherwise judged an application in advance. This is all ensuring that participants to the process have due process rights and have a fair opportunity to get the approval that they seek. Quickly, an impartial tribunal mandates that we disclose ex parte contacts. So the world of evidence in which the Planning Commission considers the decision has to be in the public record, in either writing or orally presented at a hearing. If somebody comes up to you outside of a hearing and asks you what you think about something or tries to convince you, you should think something, that is called an ex parte contact. And you can have ex parte contacts. It is anticipated that you will, but if you do, you have an obligation to disclose them on the record so that the public has an opportunity to question you about those contacts. So,
what does that look like? The question.
What does it look like?
They have an opportunity to question you about it. What would that look like? Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. It doesn't happen. Has it happened in? It hasn't. I can't remember.
I've seen it happen before the City Commission, but it hasn't happened to me.
It's happened with me when people have questioned my ability to make a proper decision. An attorney just comes up, or somebody comes up and said, I think Mr. Commissioner Guile has an interest in this or a conflict, and he should address that, and then the attorney can make the decision. And I've had to recuse myself several times.
Well, in an ex parte contact situation, you come to the hearing and the chair will say, has anybody had any ex parte contacts? And you'll say, I read a newspaper article about this application, or I saw in Oregon City Raw this post, and I read it. And so most times, if you ask me in advance, I will tell you to bring a copy of that, what you read, so we can put it in the record so that folks have an opportunity to comment about it. But in the grocery store scenario, you're buying, groceries, and somebody comes up to you and says, this conditional use permit application is gonna be before you next week. I really think you should not approve it because of the transportation issue. So you come to the hearing and you say, somebody came up to me in the grocery store and told me not to vote for this because of this transportation concern. An applicant, for example, may want to question you about that, i.e. they would ask you, so Commissioner Staggs, when you heard this, what did you think? Did you think that person was right? Did you think that person was reliable? Do you think that there's a transportation shortcoming in this intersection? And you can answer those questions. And what we're trying to get to is what the process is trying to get to is whether or not you can put that information aside or otherwise evaluate it in the public hearing process, or if that secretly has convinced you that you cannot approve this application. Because this whole review process, you're sitting as a judge, so you are going to make a decision setting aside whatever biases, whatever sort of preconceived ideas you may have. You may hate this applicant, you may think they're thief, you may think that they, are bad for Oregon City. Can you set that aside and make a decision based on the approval criteria? And so the questions should be directed to ferreting that out.
And then also the other thing is we want to make sure that we all have the same information to make a decision. That's why there's no internet on these computers. You're not allowed to have your cell phone here, texting or things like that, is that we all need to know the same information. And the applicant has the right to know what you're thinking so they can address it as well.
So is there kind of a two-part thing on ex parte contact? It's initiated by a citizen that meets you in the street or wherever, and have a conversation, and I take it there, as a commissioner, you would want to cut that conversation very short. Or it could be the reverse, that you're talking to somebody and you're talking, not thinking. We initiated the ex parte contact with, oh, I didn't know you were the attorney for that guy, or I didn't know that you were the architect or whatever. Both of those, basically you want to cut them off, and the one you start, you should be able to know better and not do that. The other one, you need to be pretty quick on your feet at the time in the grocery store or on the street corner and get out of that conversation, I think.
That is a personal choice. I would agree with you, because I think that the quicker you can cut off a conversation like that and say, look, this matter's coming before the Planning Commission next week. I urge you to come to the hearing, and I'd love to hear your comments then. Then you're encouraging participation, you are being kind, you are being open, and you're being a real human. To just, put up your hand and walk away may not be something that you want to do. But I can also appreciate the fact that you could be at a cocktail party and somebody starts talking and you don't realize what they're talking about. They're talking about an intersection and you're saying, yeah, I agree, this intersection's really horrible. And then later they disclose, oh, well, this conditional use permit that's on this intersection will affect this intersection. You should vote no for it. And then you're like, oh man, what did I do?
So
right? So sometimes you don't know.
Yeah.
That also can go back 15, 20 years. I mean, on the planning commission before, we've had school teachers who say, I used to work for the school district, so I may be impartial, but no, I'm here to make it, I'm here to be impartial. Or I've got articles in the paper that go back 15, 16 years, and so people can pull those out. So it's not just the week before or a month before. It could be anything you've said all the way back or anything you've written.
Well, and so that's different from an ex parte contact. That's your experiences, and that's
Okay,
I have experience as working for the waste treatment facility. So I have particular expertise in waste treatment.
Okay.
And so if that experience is going to color your review of an application, you need to put that experience out into the public record before the record closes. And that is the same with if you live in a neighborhood where you drive through an intersection every day and you know when the intersection is up to capacity based on your own experience. You need to share that experience before the record closes so that everybody knows this is your experience, right? And that this could influence, you think this is going to influence your decision. Right? But there may be a circumstance where what you think about an intersection is your personal feeling about an intersection, and you can set that aside to review an application, right? We're human. We can decide to put things in a box and review it pursuant to the approval criteria and make a decision based on that approval criteria, and that's all we're asking you to do. It's both a difficult challenge and an easy challenge, right? As Yoda or somebody would say, right?
Ex parte contact only occurs after the application's been submitted. Is that right? Is that what I'm remembering? Okay.
Okay. I got it wrong.
After an application has been filed.
Okay.
So if I'm talking to my neighbor about whatever he wants to do, but he hasn't actually
Filed an application, it's
that's
not an
fine.
ex parte contact.
Okay.
Okay. But what about we're talking to the neighbor and then the agenda comes up and we read it and we realize we were talking about.
That's why you have an opportunity to disclose them at a hearing, because there's a whole bunch of things we don't know about.
Or the same thing if you go out to review the property and the person comes out.
Well, yes, we have the site visits too.
Yeah, site visits.
Yeah.
Actual bias is when you have a predisposition rendering it impossible for you to make a decision. I mean, there are certain types of things that we cannot set aside our personal biases about and make an impartial decision because of where we live, because of who the applicant is, because of what the proposal is. You know, the most prevalent bias cases are with liquid natural gas proposals out at the coast and Walmart. Those are the two things that people apparently cannot get over. So, in those circumstances, you have an obligation to step down. And if you reach out to Laura, and she can work with me to help you steer through that. Conflict of interest has to do primarily with a pecuniary benefit. If you stand to benefit in a financial way from a particular proposal, then you have a conflict of interest, and in most cases, you have to step down. So, for example, the employee of the school district. We had, who was it that had a child who worked for the golf course? Mm-hmm. I don't remember who that was. Oh, Paul.
I think Ben used to, Damon used to.
So anyway, we've talked about those things. Public meetings takes a quorum in order for the planning commission to deliberate towards a decision. That is right now 4 people, right? Mm-hmm. Public meetings are open to the public. The agenda gets posted, and minutes of the meetings are taken. If there is, the issue with public meetings for your purposes is there's such a thing as a serial meeting, which is what happens when you all hit reply all. So Laura sends an email to you all saying, I want to solicit your feedback on this idea, and you all hit reply all. Even if you hit reply 4 people, that is a public meeting and requires minutes and a public opportunity to attend the meeting. So we want to avoid a reply all and instead respond directly to Laura, and she will communicate with you in due course.
I'll only blind copy you guys anyway.
So, that's the issue with public meetings.
Do you, can you talk about
Good.
when they speak to a commissioner who speaks to another commissioner?
Yeah, okay, so in addition to the reply all, I want to put the fear of reply all into you, but also the game of telephone. In other words, Commissioner Guile emails Commissioner Schlagenhofer and asks him what he thinks about something, and then some city business, I should say, not what Commissioner Schlagenhofer's had for dinner, but what something city business related. And then Commissioner Schlagenhofer thinks about it some more, and he emails Commissioner Gage. And Commissioner Gage thinks about it some more and adds to this thread to Commissioner Mitchell, Chair Mitchell, excuse me. And so it goes down the line. Even though all of you were not talking, that is a serial public meeting. And that violates public meetings law. So again, I urge you, instead of talking to each other by email, talk to Laura, and then the communication goes through Laura. There is no prohibition in talking to staff, as long as there's not 4 people talking to staff about city business at once, because then that makes it a public meeting.
I mean, it's our job to support you and make sure that you have everything you need to make an informed decision. So if you have any questions or you think we're missing a piece of evidence or something like that, we are here to serve.
So if Laura solicits feedback and 5 of us reply and then she puts that all together and emails it out to all of us, does that constitute a?
No, because it hasn't been a communication between each of you. It is a communication with Laura that Laura then consolidates and sends out.
And then I would put it in the record
No.
so the public could see.
So Wednesday night, the training in Salem, how many commissioners are going
4.
to that? 4. So we have to be careful that we don't, at a coffee break, go stand over in the corner and say, hey, we just heard something that applies to this thing that we're going to be dealing with. We have to make sure we are not talking about Oregon City business.
Perhaps make up your examples.
What?
Make up examples rather than draw from your experience.
Exactly. Yeah, don't draw from anything that we know.
Is there
Don't draw from reality.
I know the city email, and then our own private email. Is there some pros and cons of which ones we should use or which ones we should never use? And
So that has to do with the public records. So that has to do with public records, not public meetings. So public records are writings, including electronic records that have to do with public business, city business. And those things are all public records. And so work done on a private email account can be a public record, even if it is done on a private email account. This is why we issue to you and urge you to use your city email address and communicate city business using that email address. So that it's very clear when we get a public records request, we come to your city business email to review it. If you don't use your city email address and we get a public records request, we will go through your private computer, which is not something we want to do or you want us to do. So we urge you to use the city designated account for city business. You need to also avoid commenting on instant messaging or chat room provisions unless there is a mechanism in place to capture that information. As far as I know, there is no mechanism in place for Oregon City to capture that information. So that's why if you see an Oregon City raw story, print it out and bring it and put it in the record, because we don't have a way to capture it.
The attorney has done. They brought in my writings before. How did you know about Oregon City Raw? No, Mike Robinson brought in a whole printout one time of conversation.
No, I know, he printed it out.
Yeah.
There isn't an electronic saving. It's not saved in the cloud somewhere that is in Oregon City's control. All right, so the public hearing procedure is structured in order to allow fairness and allow everyone to have an opportunity to testify. The applicant bears the burden of proof, so we let the applicant go first, and we let the applicant go last. So the applicant presents their case. Then we hear testimony from its interested parties, both proponents and opponents, and then we allow the applicant an opportunity for rebuttal. And then at that point, after the rebuttal has happened, then the public record is closed. That means no new evidence is allowed, and the Planning Commission deliberates to a decision. Questions about that? When it's a crowded room, we can impose time limits. When it's not a crowded room, you don't have to impose time limits. It is at the chair's discretion, ordinarily with conferral from the Planning Commission about whether or not you want to do time limits or not. This is where all the excitement happens in the deliberation and the decision making. And your job is to determine whether the standards are met, and components of that determination include, first, interpreting the applicable criteria. That means evaluating and giving meaning to ambiguous standards that are those are not clear and objective standards. Those are standards like, is it compatible? Is the infrastructure adequate? Those are discretionary standards that you guys are charged with interpreting. We usually try, when I offer advice on how to interpret the criteria, we focus on the plain meaning of the terms, considering the context for those terms. So things like introductory portions of those policies can help inform what the meaning was or the intent of the drafters at the time. But this is why you are selected, because you are supposed to interpret what the standards require. The second job or secondary component of a supportable decision is that it's got adequate findings. That means it's adequately explains, the decision explains why the criteria are satisfied. And this is what these findings appear first in the staff report. And then the staff recommended findings get modified as part of the public hearing process. And so these findings have to address all the applicable approval criteria. And if the criteria isn't applicable, the findings have to explain why this is the case. I mean, this is basically the judge's written opinion, are these written findings. And of course, staff, with everything, staff is here to help with that. But and the more you can give us in your deliberation decision making to explain what you're thinking, explain the analysis you went through, then we are able to help you translate that in writing, and that is really the linchpin of a legally supportable decision. A decision has to be based on substantial evidence. And that means, would a reasonable person looking at this evidence, find the way that you did? This is the court, LUBA or a court of appeals will use a reasonable person standard. Is there evidence that a reasonable person would rely on to find in the way they did? And this evidence has to be in the record. It can't be based on your personal experiences outside the record. I mean, certainly it can be based on your personal experiences. You're here because you have personal experiences, but you need to share those personal experiences when the record is open, because nothing is more cringeworthy than to have the record be closed and be in deliberation. Somebody says, well, you know, I've driven through that intersection 100 times and I can tell you that it is X, Y, and Z. That is problematic because the record is closed. That is new evidence that is not in the record that folks did not get an opportunity to weigh in on, and it is something that is that your fellow commissioners now are considering for the first time instead of having an opportunity to think about it as part of the public hearing process and to question you about it. So anyway, that is why and what substantial evidence looks like.
It will also get us trouble at court too. But I did want to have one thing. Can you talk about when they're looking at geotech reports or traffic study consulting, things that are maybe a bit more technical and they're less familiar with that topic, how should they consider that evidence?
So again, the legal standard is whether a reasonable person would look at this and rely on it. Would it be reasonable for a person to rely on the opinion of a professional, licensed, experienced consultant to do X? And if you are unsure whether or not a reasonable person would find that way or would rely on that evidence, the way to go about it is to ask the expert. Ask the expert what their qualifications are. Ask the expert what kind of studies they did to determine this. Ask the expert how they calculated this. Ask the expert to explain it to you. If they can't explain it to you, then maybe a reasonable person wouldn't rely on that. When you have a situation where a battle of the experts, one traffic engineer versus another traffic engineer, the decision of who to believe rests with the Planning Commission. So LUBA would affirm a ruling by you about which to believe. If it is between a licensed traffic engineer and a lay person, you don't necessarily have to take the licensed traffic engineer's findings. But if you're not going to, you have to explain why. You have to explain why you found that traffic engineer's analysis uncredible, incomplete, why you find this lay person's testimony more reasonable. You have to explain your analysis so that the City Commission, when they review your decision, or if it gets to that point, the Land Use Board of Appeals reviews their decision, they know why. Just to say, I go with this evidence, we have to know why. So that's the kind, you know, I think that planning commissioners don't question applicants and participants enough. And I don't know if it's because we don't want people to feel put on the spot or feel defensive or why, but I think we don't, or because we don't want to look like we don't know the answer because we're the decision maker. We're supposed to know all the answers. But really, this is the opportunity. I mean, the judge questions the witnesses, right? The decision maker questions the witnesses. So that's what the public hearing process is supposed to be about.
I got one thing to say about that. I think sometimes it's not that we don't feel qualified to ask the question, but we feel like we're not. I guess maybe that's what it is. We don't feel like, why would we ask a professional, a question when I don't have the same professional capacity as the engineer. So he's a geotech, he's been doing it for 40 years, and I'm going to ask him, explain how you've done this, and just so you're going to try to, you're not trying to make him look wrong, but I don't feel like we have the capacity to, and you're going to ask him a question that's going to make you look wrong.
Sure, and I think, well,
That's
so
what
a
he's gonna
couple
do.
of thoughts about that. One, you don't have to ask many questions. You can trust him because he's a professional, right? This is his
Right.
job, and his reputation's on the line to get it right?
But he was hired by the applicant, so, you got that side too.
So, in order to provide you some independent review of this, the city has on contract a geotechnical engineer and a traffic engineer who review these technical reports and provides the planning commission their opinion as well. So it is not as though, we're trying not to set you up against, these qualified hired guns, but,
Right.
But Dirk, at the same time, there's been several occasions over the last many years I've been here where the citizens will come up and ask the same questions that I'd be interested. What time of day did you take those counts? What day of the week did you take those counts? Because a lot of people doubt when somebody's paid for by something, by, no offense to the city, or by the developer. Some of us may want to know, well, did you do that all week long, or was it only one week, and was it during
One day was
vacation
busy
time?
day.
I mean, there's questions you can ask of them because you want to know, because the citizens are telling you one thing and they're saying something different. That's
Right.
what I look for. Am I wrong?
no,
I
you're,
think you're right. I think another thing that Commissioner Guile does that's really good is I know sometimes he asks a question knowing what the answer is, but wanting to get it on the record for people who are watching or sitting in the audience, and I think that's great. There's not any problem with holding the experts' feet to the fire a little bit and making them say it on the record.
And I think that's good that technical experts can go on however deep they want to get into the acronyms and all of that study. Even if you're asking them, can you lighten that up a little bit to hit more of the population? I don't think is putting him down or arguing any of his facts, but see if he can bring it back and give an example that turns light bulbs on for more people.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would just encourage our questions to stay geared towards the applicable criteria, because I don't want us to look like we're making decisions on things that are not the applicable criteria, even though they may be interesting.
So sorry.
No, go ahead.
To your comment, Carrie, about not bringing in something during deliberation afterwards. So when is the right time? If I'm coming to a hearing and I know that there's something I want to say, is that something that should be done when we do our disclosures at the beginning, or is that something that you find time to work in during the public hearing portion of it? How should we go about that? Let's say if we make a site visit and we get a real hit impression that we want to make sure.
The disclosures is the ideal time.
Okay.
That's the best time. But sometimes I think the public hearing sort of starts going, and that jogs for you an experience that you've had that now seems really relevant.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so sometimes, it may not be something that you thought of before, but now you feel like that's really that's really important to the decision-making process. And so when it occurs to you, you need to say, assuming the record's open, you need to say, there's something that has occurred to me that I want to share with the group, based on, that's my experience that I think is germane to this review. And then you offer it.
Okay.
Let's say it comes up after the record's closed and you're in deliberation. The answer is reopen the public record.
Right.
Hear the commissioner's experience or evidence. Allow other people to testify and respond to it, and then close the record and we go back to where we were. So there's no...
We did that at one point.
Yeah, I did that.
We've done it.
The same thing that Mike asked holds true sometimes when you've listened to the public and you've had all the other witnesses for the applicants up there, and then all of a sudden you have serious doubts because you've heard things from from the audience, the citizens. And so do you bring up those doubts why it's still open, or do you, like when you're doing deliberation, well, I heard this and I heard this and I just don't know?
Well, but doubts based on the evidence that has been submitted is not the same thing as evidence that is not in the record.
Right.
Do you see the difference is you hear testimony and we go to deliberation and you say, I've got doubts about this. I'm really leaning towards finding that this particular criterion is not met either because this is what the standard requires or the evidence was this. That's different than the record closes and you say, you know what? As the owner of this particular store on this particular street, I know that there's no parking out there. Between 5 and 8 p.m., there is no parking.
True.
Well, those are factual statements that are, in other words, evidence that is not in the record yet.
Okay.
That is influencing you to make a decision a certain way, and that evidence was not in the record, and folks did not have an opportunity to respond to that.
I would also add that even if stuff was in the record, when the applicant comes back up to rebut the comments, that's a really good time to say, like, based on the evidence in the record, I'm struggling with this, because it's their job to prove how all the criteria is met. And so if you're struggling with something, saying, I don't think this is met, just tell them, and so they can at least have a chance.
So what if you feel you're being lied to by somebody like an attorney? You can't say, I don't feel you're telling me the truth.
Yeah, I mean, because
sometimes I felt we've been lied to.
that's fine. I mean, we have staff, we have other people than that one attorney that's hopefully analyzed that one thing. We've written staff reports on it, and we have maybe consultants or other things. So you can take that together and figure out who you want to believe.
So that, boy, there's lots of ways to do this, I guess, several ways, but the timing of a pertinent topic that's bugging me, I would think I would want to put that out there before the applicant's final rebuttal. You know, if you close the record and then bring it out, boy, you've handcuffed them.
It's good to do as early as possible, because then the public can also comment on it.
Right.
But if you do it too soon, you might start a force fire out there and
But it's okay, because then you're saying, here's my issue, please
Right, yeah.
figure this out.
I guess, I mean, if you look at the script, there's no spot in there for planning commissioners to insert this, right? There's no spot for that. I mean, that's the same.
No, but we have to acknowledge that, you know, there's a process that's perfect, and then there's good enough because we're all human and stuff's going to come up. So, you know,
I got one more thing. Well, probably I got more than that. But I should probably notice, but when we're deliberating, we can talk about anything that was in the application materials
yes,
and staff report, even if we didn't talk about it during the meeting.
yes.
Okay. We don't have to talk about it during the meeting to start deliberating and then thinking, you know, that one thing I saw in the staff report really makes me, you know, lean this way, even if we didn't talk about it before, when the record was open.
No, you don't have a legal obligation to raise that stuff, but what Laura's
Sometimes we
saying is
forget.
that it might be a best practice as a commissioner to put the public on notice that you have these concerns.
Right.
Just so that folks have an opportunity to respond to that concern.
Yeah, that'd be ideal. It's just sometimes it pops into your head too late,
For sure.
but you still want to bring it up. All right.
And I'm going to bring up something that Laura and I spent about a good hour after one of these meetings talking about. Some commissioners in the past who have served on here, some have quit because of it, and there's been other discussion that the staff only gives us what they want on behalf of the city. And Laura and I talked about that, and as Laura said, she's here to support us, and that the staff isn't trying to make this decision. Yet, when a lot of people feel, well, the staff is telling you, we recommend approval of this, and some commissioners and other people have felt that they're guiding us. Do you care to address that, since you and I talked about it?
Yeah, you're the decision maker, not me. We just make recommendations, and we are all human. We could have a wrong recommendation, or there could be new evidence that comes up that sways that in any particular way. But our job is to write findings for you, because you're judges. This is a legal proceeding, and we need to have findings. If we come in with a recommendation of approval, well, I'll talk about this one because it's all closed and the appeal's done. We had a recommendation for denial for the parking
lot.
adjustment because we didn't have sufficient information, and it was continued. There was more information that came in, and eventually it changed. But our job is to write findings for you. So if you want to deny something, you have an obligation to explain what your concerns are so that we can write findings for that concern. If there's something that's missing that we can help provide evidence of, let us know so we can do that. I think with that last one, staff did some additional analysis, discounting some side areas where there was no sidewalk or lighting or things like that. So that is your job to give us guidance on how something ought to be analyzed differently. And, but certainly our job is to support you so you can make an informed decision that can hold up in court, and you're a judge. So if you have a question, if you have concerns, state it so that people have a chance, the public and the applicant, to respond to them.
See, Laura, I think where the rub comes in for the citizens and some previous commissioners is the fact that when the staff says we recommend or we don't recommend, it feels like you're, even though it's not the case, but it feels like you're guiding us as to what to do, and they feel the staff should just present the findings and say this is what you're deciding.
There are some cities who do it that way.
Because they feel that the city right now is directing us.
That can be an approach. My experience with that approach is that it's not as efficient because somebody has to start the ball somewhere. Somebody has to say something, or everybody's going to sit in silence and wait for somebody else to talk first, right? And so staff takes the first shot. It is based on just the evidence the staff has. So, yeah.
But you can understand how citizens
I can understand that concern, and like I said, there are cities who do it differently.
Yeah.
But in my view, it is we have to balance efficiency and,
I think it's part of that education process for the citizens too, that just because the city recommends it doesn't mean that they're trying to get us to approve it. This is part of the process. We have to.
Sure.
But citizens don't understand everything all the time because they're not in here all the time.
Yeah, we can slip some sentences into our staff report templates that explain that a little bit more.
When we
That would be
recommend
helpful.
something that's based on the findings or the criteria or something, I don't know.
You will not hurt our feelings. Well, our job is to make sure that this process works. And so that's where, we spend a long time writing those. I'm sure everyone is not perfect, and that's okay. That's why there's 7 of you and only 1 of us writing reports, and we obviously check them and things like that, but it is okay. You don't feel like you are pressured to do anything at all.
Thanks.
okay, we're way past my allotted time budget, so.
Okay, I'm sorry, can I ask just one more quick question?
No.
Okay.
Yes, please, Commissioner Stoll.
About the experts and questioning them, so I've never seen any of the city's traffic engineers come in to a meeting, but obviously applicants usually have them in. I'm guessing that's mostly because the cities, in the last year, there's been no conflict between experts. If there is a conflict between experts, if the applicant's traffic engineer says one thing, the city says something else, then would the city's engineer come in to offer their point of view, or?
Yes, that's a good question. So I make a financial call on if it makes sense to us to pay someone to come in or not. So, you may have seen, I forgot on Beaver Creek Road if we had our transportation engineer, double check that study. But if you have a concern when you read any of the reports, let me know, and that will trigger me to have our transportation engineer come in.
Okay.
So it's all in a risk analysis. If we think it's no big deal, there's no comments on it, and it's pretty standard.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for the last year, it's been, yeah, we agree, basically, so there hasn't
We
really
work
been a
with them a
conflict.
lot in advance, And so we get people who don't turn in applications because it doesn't work out,
Oh, I
or who change their stuff significantly in order. So I think their goal as an applicant is to try and narrow the issues and add a little bit more certainty, so.
Right, okay, thank you.
So when you find that there are some cases that you'll determine that an application cannot be approved based on what they have proposed, but conditions of approval can get it there. In other words, there's something you can condition the applicant to do in order to assure that the criteria are satisfied. And this can be plant a certain number of trees. It can be install a certain type of curb or a certain type of sidewalk. So I'm going to jump forward to there is a constitutional requirement that these conditions have to relate directly to the impact from the development, and they have to be roughly proportional. In other words, there has to be a proportional relationship between the ask set forth in the condition and the impact from the development. In other words, asking a single property owner who wants to develop wants a partition to add another house on a parcel of land cannot be asked to install an entire sewer pump station. Because that sewer pump station will serve hundreds of residential lots and not a single property owner. So they can only be forced to shoulder their percentage of the cost of that pump station. And we can work with the applicants and the planning commission to sort of identify these areas where we may come into a constitutional limitation on our ability to exact or condition a development. But you need to know that that is an obligation and something that is out there as well. What else do you want to talk about takings? I just wanted to bring it full circle so that we started with the Constitution and we end with the Constitution. See how I did that?
That's fine.
Anyway. Questions, comments, criticisms, jokes?
Oh, I do have one more thing to add, which was about record stuff. If you make notes during a meeting.
Oh, I should have said that, yeah.
Then we will collect those after the meeting and those will become part of the record.
So how are you supposed to, if it's continued on to the next one, how are you supposed to remember what were your notes, the questions you wanted to ask? I've run it out a lot of times. I'd rather just write it on my hand so you can't keep my hand because I want to ask these questions later.
We will send you copies of it. If you give it to us that night, I will email it you the next day if you want. I can take a picture of it and.
So like tonight, I've been writing down questions for Carrie for later, and so I'm supposed to turn this in because they're questions for Carrie?
No, this isn't a public,
I'm just feeling
It's a public record. It's not part of the record of a proceeding.
Yeah.
So what do our notes have to do with public record when we're jogging notes to ourselves to remember to ask things? Well, how's that a part of a public record?
Isn't this
This is the
a
Westland
dispute in Westland right now? Yeah, I thought so.
Uh-oh, I didn't hear about that one.
Whether or not an individual commissioner's notes are a public record.
Is it only when the record is open on a particular
the only
land?
public
No,
record what
no,
the whole
there's-
body
no.
does? And I don't know that it's been.
Well, for 6 years, we passed notes up and down up here and nobody said anything.
Okay, in West
You
Lynn,
cannot pass notes up and down here.
in West Lynn,
To be very
I
clear.
love you.
you can pass notes about what kind of flavor of ice cream you want to get at Menchie's, but you cannot, so in West Lynn, there was a commissioner who took a lot of notes. And a citizen who happened to be in law school filed a public records request asking for copies of those notes as a public record. When I say the word public record, that is different from the record of a proceeding in a land use case. Those are two different things that have many similar words in them. But a public record is a writing related to city business. So what kind of flavor you like at Menchie's is not city business. But questions you may have about this presentation that are written down could theoretically be a public record. And if someone were to file a public records request, it is possible that we would have to turn over those notes. And so this law student went to circuit court and challenged the city's ability to withhold this commissioner's notes, this counselor's notes, and they lost.
The attorney lost or
The city lost.
city lost?
And so there is some precedent, and it happens to be in Clackamas County, that notes written by a counselor or a commissioner are public records.
So even though you have handouts to us, and they've been pretty thick over the code enforcements, and we've all made notes on the side like this, we need to change this, or we should do this.
That could be a public record.
Those stacks have to be given back to you, even though those are notes to
They
jog
don't
our
have to
memory.
be given back to us, but if we got a public records request for that document, we would have to produce it.
Because I'd hate to see with
And
Denise.
so that's why we ask that you give them to us.
Yeah.
Because then we don't have to go through the trouble to try to get it.
Or if you've recycled it. The city commission will just pass down their pieces of paper at the end of every meeting.
Would this apply to a legislative action we're doing?
It would
As
be
well as
anything discussing public city business.
Because I also know that several
So
times.
when we got those 400-page code amendments here.
That's what I was referring
8
to.
months ago when we scribbled all over it?
That was pre-case. That was pre this
Okay,
case.
okay.
Actually, because it was like a year ago.
But, you know, like some of the hearings when we have that place packed, I think all of us, or some of us commissioners and previously, we would take notes. This person came up and they said this person came up and said this.
Sure.
Because you're trying to keep track in your mind of who said what. And so even those, we have to give to you when
Absolutely.
we're trying to remember who said what.
Right.
Wow.
But we can take a picture of it first, right?
Yeah, well, you got a camera, we'll take a picture of it.
That's going to lengthen some of our meetings, I would think. If we have notes, we can get to it, but if we don't have notes to say, oh, yeah, I got to ask this question.
Well, you can have the
You
notes.
can
just
still
have
take
to-
a note. I mean,
just
if you have
to
a
save the
note that
notes.
says, ask this question or curious about that, it's fine. You don't be discouraged from writing it down. We just want them once they're written.
Okay.
Sorry, it took longer than I thought.
Well, that's because we had questions, and I think it's good.
One question on this. Can we get a copy of this?
For sure. Absolutely.
We'll send it out.
I think we
Good.
would all
Yeah,
might
good
want
idea.
that.
Yeah.
Good idea. All right, anything else on that topic? Okay, 4B, 2020 agenda items not related to land use applications.
Oh, no.
Wow, that's a cool shot of the bridge.
Only 2 slides.
It is only 2 slides, yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. We're playing, for side note, we're doing templates for staff reports, or we're playing around with certain templates, so you may see the same templates over and over as time goes on. So you may see this bridge a lot. So you're gonna have a lot of land use applications, presumably in this next year. We know of a couple of big ones that are coming down the line. I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about the other stuff we need to do rather than the process land use applications. We will be working on our comprehensive plan update. I'll be giving you more information as that progresses. We were awarded 1 grant, and we are tentatively awarded a 2nd grant. We're working on a consultant. Don't worry, more information to come. At the City Commission update this past December, these are the items that were listed as far as the other things that we were gonna do this next calendar year. So it's work sessions with HRB, TAC, NRC, and CIC. And then also, at the end of this year, we're going to start to want to gather our thoughts on what should go in the next biennium, goals and associated. The last time we did goals and budget, the Planning Commission had a recommendation of some items they thought the City Commission should tackle. And so we'll be looking at that too. Does this look correct? Is there anything specifically you want to talk about with any of these boards or committees? Or do we still want to do all this? I just want to make sure that I'm supporting you the best way that I can. Is there other legal training we need? Are there specific topics you want to talk about?
Are there topics for all of these meetings, or is this just a sort of, let's just do it once a year kind of thing?
I have not heard the planning commission say that they wanted to talk about anything specifically with any of these. If you do, that would be helpful, but I have not heard. I've just heard the planning commission say you want to meet with them.
So we're not involved with the Grand Ronde decision. I know there's a city meeting, I think up at Pioneer Center. But the
Library.
At the library, but there is no, planning commission is not yet involved with anything. That's just a city commission process right now with the Grand Ronde.
Yeah, the city commission is meeting with the tribal council of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde later this week, and it's just a meet and greet to get to know each other.
It's an open to the public though, right?
It is,
Okay.
yeah. And the planning commission will be reviewing phase 1 of the Riverwalk when it is ready to be reviewed. So you'll be included as a part of this review authority.
From what I read, it's going to be different from what all the charrettes that we went through for a while, that the Grand Ronde Indians have determined a different way to handle it than what we all had decided. Is that true? Or?
No, they're working on an alternate approach to
Alternate
phase
is what I
1.
meant.
Just phase 1 though, right? Not the whole design. The community
Okay.
worked together on a full design of the Riverwalk.
Okay.
So, still early on, we'll see where it goes. But we're looking forward to it.
8 years we'll see it.
I've been impressed. They're working quickly.
I think we were saying for the Transportation Advisory Committee, I think Chair Mitchell wanted to talk about the separated bike lanes. I don't know if they have some input in that.
We did,
Okay,
and we will tell you next time we see you.
nice.
Okay. Any other comments on this, or this is something we could think about this list and we can discuss it at our next meeting or two and revise it if we need to?
If things come up like neighborhood associations are starting to ask questions about a technical thing, or you hear people concerned about geotechs or something, we can always do educational sessions as needed as well.
Yeah. All right. Communications.
I only have one thing, and that's the state is hosting community conversations on additional housing choices and housing supply. This has to do with some recent legislative House bills 2001 and 2003, and 2 of them are this week. And so on Wednesday, January 29th, from 7 to 9 p.m. at PCC Willow Creek in Hillsborough, they'll be meeting to have that community conversation. And then there's one on our side of the river on Thursday, January 30th, from 6 to 8 p.m. at Clackamas Community College Harmony Campus in Milwaukee.
And those are both related to which?
House Bills 2001 and 2003. Those
Okay.
are the up to 4plexes and single-family residential zones.
Yep.
And the obligation to the House Bill 2003 is an obligation to provide more granular evaluation of housing needs. Right now, we do low, medium, high housing prices, and we have to drill down on that more under this bill to evaluate both the demands on the demand side and the supply side in terms of what is affordable and what is not.
What was the one in Milwaukee?
It's on Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. at CCC Harmony.
Okay.
Not to extend the meeting, but I do have a question for you. I've been watching on the news about Salem and where they've allowed camping and where they're not. Has Oregon City done anything about that at all? About making rules you can't be up here or there? Or is there anything in there that I've missed about it?
Yeah, the city commission was considering some changes to our camping ordinance. And I think they did review one, and they may have to come back for a second round.
I know
I'll have to follow up.
We've been going over affordable housing, but of course that same subject comes up side by side about all the homeless people.
There's a couple of court rulings that helped limit some cities' abilities to do things, so they had to change some
Okay.
of the ways that they regulated when people can move. I think eventually, this is a planner talking about things that are not planning, but I believe the court said you can't ask people to move from public property if they have no place to move to.
A decision in Boise.
Boise, yeah.
To provide an alternative place for them to go.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And you cannot limit their ability to sleep. So you have to let them sleep, and then in the morning you can move them. I think is what I heard.
Anything else?
That's it.
I think we're straying.
Carrie, Laura, thank you very much. That was very helpful. We appreciate it. Chris, once again, welcome.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.